Museum of History Studios. You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this special episode of Addressing Gettysburg. We're doing it as a live stream, which we don't normally do on Saturdays. Typically, this would be a Patreon episode, but it's a new book by our friend Stephen Evangelista. He has another book out called Our Story, correct?
Correct.
It's rare that I remember the title of a book without it in front of me. And even with it in front of me, I often forget it. So Our Story, which is about Battery B, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery, right?
Correct.
Got that right, too. And it is a great read. If you love the human interest side of history and you want to read about people and not, grand tactics and movements and strategies and all that stuff, and you just want to hear about the stories of the men of the battery, that is a great book for you to get. Each chapter is a mini biography of these guys, right?
Yep, a mini biography.
And it is moving. Some of these stories are very moving. We've done a few of them on the show before, and I always pick the ones that kind of make me well up a little bit. So it's definitely worth getting. Where can people get that?
At evangelistabooks.com.
And spell Evangelista.
EVANGELISTA books.com.
Very good. Yep. All right. So we're talking about his new book, which is called Forever Silenced. And this is about what's known as the Gettysburg Gun. And this is a great story. And now, so we're going to talk about what's the chapter's called The Charge. But it's not about Pickett's charge. Although the battery in this gun was in Pickett's charge.
Of course.
But that's not what we're talking about in this chapter, and we'll get to that in a second. But let me tell you the story that I heard from a guide years ago, and this is how I heard the story, and this is why you always got to be careful what you hear. Okay, so the story I heard was a round got stuck in the muzzle of the gun after the powder had been put in, and so the gun was then put in the State House in Rhode Island, and it stood there in the rotunda for years, and tours would go by it, and one time a tour was going through, and the guide talked a little bit about it, and somebody raised their hand and said, well, does that mean there's still gunpowder in it? And then they said, well, I guess there is. And then, then they went and got the authorities, and then they diffused it, basically, or disarmed it, whatever the term is.
Right.
That's the story I heard on a tour once. But then I was reading Chapter 8 today, and that is not quite how it goes.
No.
Now, Chapter 8 is about the Gettysburg gun, being
demilitarized.
Demilitarized, that's the word, thank you. Demilitarized, and how that all came to be. The rest of the book, though, covers the history of the gun,
right? Which is
very interesting. So, but let's talk about. So everybody knows this story already. So I don't feel bad talking about the right version of it on this show, because they're going to go buy the book and get the rest of the story. That's what we want them to do.
Let's hope.
So, okay, no, they will. You will, right, guys?
Because you said so.
Because I said so.
Right.
They're going to get it at evangelistabooks.com.
Yes.
EVANGELISTA books.com. Okay, so tell me the real story. What did the guide and what have I been telling wrong for all these years?
Well, let me first say that the reason why I wrote this book was because there were many stories about the Gettysburg gun that were not necessarily all incorrect, but at best they were incomplete. And people don't always understand why and what happened to this gun. Now, most people will know on July 2nd and 3rd, sort of the general story of the gun. But what happened after that? And so let's talk about the charge that was placed in the muzzle of the gun. We all know, because we talked about
there.
This. Yeah, we talked about this on other shows, but on July 3rd, Sergeant Albert Strait, in an attempt to reload the gun after it was struck by the second shell, actually took apart the charge. And everyone knows that, a Civil War shell or a Civil War, ammunition is basically three parts. You have a ball, solid ball, you have a wooden disc, and then you have the powder charge. Well, when that muzzle was dented, he actually had to take it apart to get the powder charge into the muzzle, and then he tried to jam the ball in, and as we all know, the ball got stuck.
Right.
Okay. So in the act of doing that, he puts the powder charge all the way down into the breech of the gun.
Separates it from the ball.
Separates it from the ball, separates it from the wooden disc.
Pause there for a second, because there's a great point in the book that you make that typically the whole thing goes in at once.
Yes, it's one package. It's one package. And that ball, like a solid shot, is actually attached by this wooden disc, and it has metal crisscross bands to it. So it all stays together. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about, ammunition charges, we think, well, it's a solid ball. It's like a bowling ball. No, it's got 3 pieces to it, right? And it's all attached. So in the act of loading it, he had to take it apart because the muzzle being dented, it couldn't get through together. So he put the powder charge first, and then he tried to ram the ball down, and that's where it got stuck in the muzzle. I'm not
trying to second guess a man in the heat of battle here.
Right.
But wouldn't he have... I'm surprised he wouldn't have known that if he can't get it in altogether, then the ball's not going to go in if he can get the powder bag in. I mean, because the powder bag is softer. I'm sure it's more malleable, even though it's probably pretty firm.
I think it was the wooden disc that would have been problematic. And the crisscross bands.
Okay. So because they make it a little bigger.
It's a little bigger.
Yeah.
Probably thinking if I can just get past the dent, the ball will go down, and then it'll go in, and then we'll just fire it. And
sure.
What the heck happened?
Who cares? Because they're so close.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's such, there's such dreadful conditions that they're going to do anything.
Right.
So once that ball is in the muzzle of the gun and it sort of gets sintered into there, right? In the heat of battle, no one's thinking, oh, there's something down there. I mean, it's it's terrible condition.
Sure.
The battery's called off the field. And there's a lot that we can talk about what happens in between July 3rd and 1962, which is 99 years later.
Yeah.
But for the purposes of this conversation and for readers, and hopefully they'll read the intervening chapters, we'll fast forward from 1863 to 1962. Roughly 99 years afterwards. And there had been, not a lot of activity for, say, the past 50 years where the gun was actually, and by the way, for our listeners, when we say the gun, we're not talking about a pistol. We're talking about a Civil War cannons were called guns. So the Gettysburg gun basically sat in the State House for a few decades. And it, was just sort of resting in its alcove. Well, there had been a theory that was passed along, and the theory was by this captain. He was actually at the Newport Naval Museum. He was the captain of the USS Dorothy, which was a World War II workboat, and he was a very learned guy. And he passed on this theory to his boss, and his boss was Jackson Jenks. And he said, I've been thinking about this because these guys know about artillery and they know about war. And he says, yeah, I have this theory that perhaps there is a powder charge still in the breech of the Gettysburg gun. Now, this was a casual conversation. Mm-hmm. So Jackson Jenks, who is the director of the museum and, has some clout, says, that's interesting. And he sort of leaks the story to a local television station. And they love it. And before they knew it, the Naval Ordnance Team, the Rhode Island National Guard, sort of descended on the Gettysburg gun and said, we need to investigate this. Now, most people at the time were like, well, you can't just take the gun. This belongs to the state of Rhode Island.
Right.
So they actually were able to do some investigative research, and they came across an affidavit. And this 1908 affidavit was from George R. Madison, who was part of Battery B and happened to be the ammunition fixer on the Gettysburg gun on July 3rd. Mm. And he says... No.
What does the ammunition fixer do in the crew? Where is he?
He's at the limber chest, and he's fixing ammunition to be able to be brought forth to the gun to be fired.
So now, when you say fixing ammunition...
They're cutting fuses.
Okay.
And they're getting the ammunition charge ready to be brought up. So they're going to hand that to the number 5 man. The number 5 man will run it up to the number 2 man, and the number 2 man will load it into the piece.
The charge isn't all ready-made, it has to be made according to the needs of the gun.
If it's a shell, it's going to be, or if it's a fuse, they're going to have to cut the fuse. Mm-hmm. But some of these solid shot were ready to go.
Okay.
All right. So in this case, it's a solid shot.
And by ready to go, are they attached to the powder bag, or would that have? Okay. Yes, so they come all together.
Yes.
Okay.
And they were actually color coded. I mean, it was really well.
So you don't think of it you think of that as a modern thing.
No, they were really, when these things came in, they were ready to roll.
Yeah, okay.
And they had to be ready to roll.
Yeah, of course. That makes sense.
So anyway, they come into the Gettysburg, they come into the Rhode Island State House, and they get this affidavit from the grand niece of George R. Madison. Her name was Mrs. Dunn. And she said, well, look, I have this affidavit from my great uncle. And in the affidavit, it says that Sergeant Strait loaded that gun and put the powder bag in and so they said, oh, well, we do have this really interesting So it was enough to investigate. So they then take the tube, the bronze tube off of the Gettysburg gun. So they leave the wooden carriage and they bring it to a site in Smithfield, Rhode Island National Guard site in Smithfield, Rhode Island. And if you look at the pictures in the book, it's sort of horrifying because at first they actually try to drill out the ball. which is what the whole Gettysburg gun is about.
Right.
And if you look at closely the pictures in the Gettysburg gun, you'll see that there were drill marks. But fortunately for the Gettysburg gun, which is one of the many tests that it withstood, they couldn't penetrate the bronze.
Yeah.
So that's that.
Yeah.
So they use air and water pressure to actually blast 2.5 pounds of gunpowder out of the gun, including pieces of flannel that the gun was wrapped in the flannel bag. So here it is. Cool. It all comes out.
Yeah. And they did that through the vent.
They did that through the vent.
They had to drill through the vent because that was drillable.
Yes, and they also had some near the trunnions there. These are the sides of the gun. There's some air there. So they blasted all out.
Okay.
Now, interestingly enough, and this is sort of like, in addition to drilling holes into the gun, which is sort of, in my opinion, very sacrilegious.
Yeah.
They also tried to use a speedometer cable, and they snaked it through the vent hole to see if they could probe and see what else was in there.
Uh-huh.
And in doing so, the speedometer cable snapped. So inside the tube of the Gettysburg gun today is a speedometer cable.
Yeah, that's
just sort of left behind.
Yeah.
Now they can't get it out.
There's another thing stuck in the damn gun.
Not so good. But they then, after they sort of got all the air out and got all the they got all the water out, then they submerged it in a sort of a small pool of water overnight for good keeping.
Yeah, that's smart.
Then they take it out and they bring it back and they put it back onto back on the carriage, and there it sits. Now they did close up the vent hole. I don't know if you see this in the pictures. They close up the vent hole and they try to get it to a pretty good condition. But I mean, let's face it. I mean, doing that to the gun was really harmful.
Sure.
Because they had to manipulate it in a way that probably shouldn't have been manipulated.
Now, why would they not have assumed? Like, why all the investigation? Why would they not have assumed that if there's a ball in the muzzle of the gun, then the powder goes in first, so it must be in there? Why wouldn't they have assumed that?
I don't know why people didn't realize that. I mean, you'd have to know a lot about artillery and about how it works.
But that's like fundamental.
It is
powder
very
goes
fundamental.
first.
Powder goes first, and when you load a charge in, the powder's first, and then the wooden disc, the sabot, and you've got the ball. But even the Battery B veterans, and this is an important point, the Battery B veterans, after the war was over, the Gettysburg gun eventually made its way to the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C., and sat there from 1863 to 1874. In May of 1874, the Battery B veterans literally petitioned Congress through an act of Congress to move the gun from Washington, D.C. back to Rhode Island.
Wow.
And you would have thought that even they would have known that there was a powder bag still in the breech of the gun.
Sure.
And thanks to Captain Phil DeMaria, who is the captain of the modern day battery, who has allowed me exclusive access to the Battery B archives and collection, I had access to their meeting notes or their minutes. Now, every year from 1874 up until about 1921, the Battery met every year for their annual meeting called the Battery B Veterans Association. I have their meeting, fascinating minutes that they took, and they wrote everything down. And they don't mention that this gun could still be loaded. In fact, at one point during the 1880s, they actually took the gun and they had it inscribed. And you'll see a pretty large picture in the book about the inscription on the gun. Now think about this. They did that and it was loaded. And obviously they're inscribing it.
Right.
And there are many other places, and I won't give it all away, but there are many other things that gun went through where gunpowder over time becomes more volatile,
right.
not less.
Black powder, yeah.
Black powder,
yeah.
Right. So
unstable.
So the reason why, there are two reasons why I really wanted to write this book. One was because I wanted to complete what was incomplete or correct what was incorrect in these stories. That was the first thing. Because the only thing worse than history being forgotten is history getting wrong.
Right.
That's worse.
Yeah.
So you want to correct that. The other thing was that I wanted to really sort of demonstrate that the Gettysburg gun technically should not have survived. It should not have surprise.
Listen to the rest of this interview and dozens like it. Support the show and get early access to special episodes, early and discounted ticket sales, and more. The second lieutenant level and above gets access to all monthly Patreon episodes. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg, choose a tier, and join. And I thank you in advance.